Hey, I'm Tim, and in this video, we're going to start assembling the backpack. So we have our three main components ready. We have our shoulder straps, our back panel, and the main body panel with the collar attached to it. So here we're going to start by attaching the shoulder straps to the back panel, and then we'll assemble this set with the main body and the top collar. So first, let's attach the shoulder straps to the back panel along the top edge, just following the back panel's curve down to the alignment mark at the side. We sewed the shoulder straps to the back panel starting at the middle and going down to each side, and that just helps with alignment. So now we're going to flip everything over and we're going to stitch the main body on top of the back panel. Let's talk about two different methods for assembling the bag. The conventional way that most people are going to be familiar with is you assemble the bag inside out and then flip it to the right side out. Assembling your hardware and webbing can be difficult because the alignment and placement is done prior to stitching, so you're sewing it in blind. Also, all tension on this hardware is actually on the main construction seam of the bag itself. An alternative method is to sew the bag with right sides out, so you're sewing on the face side of the fabric. Here, once the construction seams are done, you would go back and insert your webbing and hardware into the seam allowance and then bind over this, and you can easily see what you're doing. And further, all tension on this webbing is actually in the seam allowance and binding, not on the construction seam of the bag itself. Attach the main body to the back panel. I like to clip it in place. I double check that the base of the darts align to the seam allowance on the back panel. And I'm going to start here at the bottom, come around, and then start going up the side. Once you get up to the top where your collar is, you're going to switch from stitching your main body to actually stitching your collar to the back panel. So we're going to follow this around, and we're going to stop a little short because that'll give us some flexibility on the seam allowance for the vertical seam going up the collar. So showing you what I did here, I had drawn my seam allowance onto the collar and basically just did my best to continue to shape the top collar onto the back panel appropriately so I could stitch right along that seam mark. And I just kept my back panel aligned to my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here's another view of how I'm trying to make this turn. So first I pulled the shoulder straps completely up underneath the back panel so the back panel is laying flat. And then I'm starting to arrange the top collar. You can see my seam line here that I've drawn on there. Aligning the seam line to the needle with an eye towards the back panel staying aligned with my seam allowance. But I leave this open so that I can adjust my seam allowance for the vertical closure at the end. If you wait, you can clean up and you won't have any puckering at the end because you're adjusting this seam allowance based on how much material is actually left when you get to where you need to close it. You see I have this clip now and there won't be any puckering. I'm going to finish this seam and I'm going to come right to where these two will join. I'll kick this out of the way. I'll do the other side. I'll close that up, and then I'm going to do a flat felled seam that comes up the vertical. So I have my vertical seam stitched nearly completely closed. There's no puckering on either side. You can see I've got my flat felled seam inserted there. I made sure I didn't catch anything on the front. I double checked as I was going that I was pulling these panels apart so that you don't see any rippling on the inside. And then as I got towards the end, I just made sure that the hanger for the bladder was out of the way. Alright, so for my G-hook, I'm going to have just this loop, and I'm going to stitch this right into the seam allowance. So there you go, you got the little webbing loop at the top for the G-hook, and when this rolled down, the G-hook will go through there, and you've got adjustability with this piece of webbing on the front.